For me, the times that we're in where we lack a weaving third, a weaving myth, a story, a cosmology that weaves us into the whole in some way, and that helps us weave the parts of ourselves that we have othered, that we've alienated, that we've taken as perverse, helps us weave those back into ourselves as well, and therefore into the whole. I really feel and sense and see a time where many are incredibly lost to ourselves, to each other, and to the world in which we are very, very much a part of. And so I feel this incredible, and I mean, our organism, our mind, our psyche is incredibly adaptive, incredibly creative. And so in some ways, I feel this resurgence as a real reclamation of those parts of our psyches, of ourselves, plural, as a means to reweave ourselves back into a whole, and restore and reclaim the parts of ourselves that we have taken as perverse or other, and in some ways cut off as not me. So in some ways, there's a kind of organismic impulse to find me again and include more of me in that concept of what it is to be me.
The gender, what we think of as gender, is lagging also behind, and there's a lot of nostalgia, especially I think in masculinity. And I think it's so interesting that Ian, your title, Restoring Masculinity, can so easily be slurred as restoring masculinity, and that would be a great mistake, to imagine that there's like a place to go back to. And so I think that the upheaval that we're experiencing is a rebellion against the limitations of gender as they have been conceived through the history of human consciousness. And all of these eruptions are protests in different forms against that limitation. So I think as long as we imagine that there's been a wound that we have to return to in some way, we're going to miss the call of what I would call, following Jung, the call of the collective unconscious to actually develop into unknown territory. And I think these eruptions are the human being saying, no, I can't exist under the prevailing definitions of my gender, and yet I feel gendered. So there's this panic. I feel gendered, and yet I can't exist as I need to exist under these genders.
For myself, queerness, and much of what I speak about, I guess, in my posture, when it comes to both gender and queer ways of being, and I guess this does speak into the paradoxical nature of Genevere's notion of gender both as lie and a truth. For me, similarly, within queerness, there is a sense of it being a mythopoetic identity for me. It's not so much as who I love, it's how I love. It's a sense of identity that in some ways actually goes well beyond identity. It's an identity that has a soul centricity to it. And it, for me, queering, the verb of queering, and therefore the identity that I hold, at least as a queer man, is to question. To be queer is to query, to question, and to live in the tension of the tension between what is and what might be. And it does feel like this panicky response of what is doesn't feel all that there is. And so I must live in question. I must live as a question. In some ways, I see it as I'm willing to risk my identity for possibility. And if there was to be a Venn diagram between my genuine curiosity and my identity, queerness would be that in-betweenness, that I'm willing to risk who and how I know myself to be in order to edge into the realm of possibility. And so to live as a question.
In my book on post-Taoism, I'm writing about gender. There's a whole thick chapter that I'm working on gender. And a lot of it has to do with the redefinition of yin and yang outside of masculinity and femininity completely, which is tremendously liberating. And I'll get into that in a minute. And then some of it has to do with what you and I broached, Ian, in the other talk about theatrical spirits. And I'll try and get into that too. And all of that relates to this. And then some of it has to do with the collective unconscious. And what I believe, and most of you understand the Jungian idea of the collective unconscious, that human consciousness is both personal, but also impersonal in the sense that it's building in time and creating a collective idea of the psyche. And I think there's been a collective idea of gender as well. So there's a collective unconsciousness of maleness and a collective unconsciousness of femaleness, and a weak and slowly returning collective unconsciousness of non-binariness. And I think that what is so intimidating about what you're asking, Ian, is the dual responsibility to take responsibility for the evolution of gender, and therefore to identify with it. And at the same time, as a major part of that responsibility, embody what I call a parthenogenesis of gender. Parthenogenesis is a botany term where a living plant will drop off part of itself to regrow another part of itself. And I think that to be really simple and blunt, men are responsible for a parthenogenetic growth of gender. That means they have to let things go in order to grow other things. And the fear that you're talking about, and this is a very mystical thing, and I don't know if I can actually explain it and so quickly, but identity, we hold on to identity when we lack a connection to immensity, when we lose faith in how our ability to participate in immensity, in satisfactions that are beyond identity. And I believe that satisfaction in life is actually the continual loss of identity and then the refinding of identity. But if you don't believe in nature, in friendship, in eroticism, in sacrifice, in the idea of your responsibility to the eternity of your own soul through the refinement of your desires. If you don't believe in these huge things, you're going to hold on to identity for dear effing life, right? Because that's all you have. And so the fear of that happens between like a total openness about gender and a wanting to identify and cash oneself and root oneself down in an identity. I am a man, I am a woman. That's not a wrong impulse. I'm not one of these people that believes there's no such thing as gender and that's where we're heading. On the contrary, I think it is we're incumbent upon modern people is a sophisticated identity with gender that understands that we're responsible for evolving it into places where it never has been before, and that nostalgia would be the great failure in that. Now, there is an identity that says I am, and that's very important. But there's a subtlety with this, that the truest I ams, the truest solidity with identity, is curious about what I am not. And there's a paradox there, right? I am, when it's really an I am, becomes what am I not? And it doesn't become a mirror of self-confirmation ad nausea throughout a lifetime, right? So so we're confused because of a hyper-psychological culture that says, if you find your identity, you're going to find your life. And I disagree with that. I would say that if you find your identity, you're on the brink of becoming healthy enough and strong enough to lose your life in a certain sense, to begin to transform beyond your identity. Because an identity in this pejorative sense is a constant confirmation of what your ego wanted you to be. But when you're living a powerful life, a mythopoetic life, you're being constantly inspired in the old Greek way, inspirazione. You're being overwhelmed by desires that move you out of the limited identity that you've constructed for yourself, right? So that, since it's a masculinity conversation, so that a man that learns how to walk like this with lots of space between his arms and shakes hands to crush the hell out of everybody and whatever, he suddenly becomes insufficient to himself. He feels ungraceful. He feels like he's not having a relationship when he shakes hands like that, he doesn't even know that person. And that inadequacy gives him pain and makes him want to transform, and his identity becomes suspect to him.
Mm.
And that's transformation.
Yeah, I'm still, I guess, wrapping all of this into the original quote you shared, which was something along the lines of, we oppress what we fear. And I would also add another component to that: we fear what we do not understand, or we do not have the capacities imaginally, emotionally, and otherwise to include in ourself, in our identity structure. That in some ways there is almost an animalistic, biological, there is a fear response, a panic response to otherness, to a neighboring tribe, to a predator. There is an animalistic response to otherness, and it requires us to be able to understand that enough to be able to develop the higher cortical, social, pro-social functioning to coexist interspecies, intergenerationally, interculturally. These are capacities, I would say, of mind, of heart, of body. And so to move beyond the simple reactivity of fear, not to bypass the fear and say it doesn't exist, but to include it in a vaster landscape that says, yes, I am an animal, and I'm also a human creature that is here to include, and to include so that we can start to have a different kind of conversation. We can start to move to different kinds of possibilities, to different kinds of questions. And so for me, and this can be both what I do not understand outside of the world, but of course is simply a mirror to my world inside. If we, I guess, look at a lot of Jung's work and the idea of the shadow, and the shadow being parts that I do possess, but are unable to hold within myself for many reasons. And then I project that into the space around me and fear this, that, or the other, of the other. And so I guess there's one conversation I feel is important in all of this is the original pronoun of the us, and the us and the we in me, and in the many. And for me, moving beyond, I guess, a gender politic or a moral superiority around gender orientation, I guess I also just really feel to make sure I do mention this in all conversations such as this that I'm part of, is that I in no way want to espouse queerness as the right orientation. There's no moral superiority. For me, what's most important about this is that we are acknowledging the ways in which, as Zhenevere beautifully mentioned, our identity can help us move towards immensity and also intensity, I would say. That both the luminosity and the intensity of life can be held within our concept of self. I guess is my orientation in these conversations and in my own relationship with myself, is I very much see myself living in widening circles. If we were to think in terms of Joanna Macy's ecological self concept, is that there is my self, but my self exists within, I would say, my mind, and my mind exists within life, and life is just this ever unflowing process and stream of both energy and information. And I'm constantly wanting myself to pour over into life. so that it remains alive and it's planted in the ground again. And so for me, that takes a constant ability to understand what is not yet included in my sense of self, and both be able to regulate and integrate that within my notion of self.